After Oxford phase, I publish in the most serious journals in the English language in the world. Let us assume Africa has come to my clinic. My name is Ali Mazrui.
Ali Mazrui, of course, is a legend. He connects you to the long history of the East African coast. The Mazrui family being important political players since the early modern period. We are talking about several centuries.
Mazrui is a political scientist with a literary bent.
He's a person who talks to some of the most influential people in the world, such as Nelson Mandela.
Mazrui was never in Nairobi. They denied him a chance to teach in Nairobi.
He's Makere's gem, our very own Mazrui.
He has extraordinary accomplishments.
Mazrui was really prominent. We had been reading his tantalizing articles.
My first experience of debating with head of state was with Obote.
He would get criticized from the right because he was a communist, and he would get criticized from the left because he was a CIA agent or whatever.
You can't box him as a communist or a socialist or this or that. He's himself. He's Ali Mazrui. He's my dad.
He has failed often to understand that there is a difference between Zionism and Judaism.
I've never confused Judaism with Zionism.
Professor Mazrui had just produced his Triple Heritage documentary, been screened on U.S. public television, received some criticism for being anti-American.
Clearly, they're believing I'm associated with terrorism.
We're dealing with a creative genius.
He was the first one to talk about Africa's Islamic heritage.
He's a very loving, caring husband.
People would call me the second Ali Mazrui.
I'm a product of three civilizations, you see, and sometimes compatible and sometimes I have to sort them out. So I became a kind of walking triple heritage. But under Obote, especially his first time in power, most of the time it didn't last, this my being out of favor. Then I would get invited to the White House and have tea with him, etc. So we had this very intriguing experience of up and down. Depending upon whether I'd criticized him or not. But he treated me virtually as a fellow Ugandan. That went well, except for one occasion, where he locked up the editor of a magazine, very similar in type to this magazine. This just happens to be here. This one is a South African magazine. There's a magazine in Uganda called not Thinker but Transition magazine. So he locked up the editor of the magazine, and he also locked up Abu Mayanja, who was a distinguished lawyer in Uganda. And because Abu Mayanja had written a letter to Transition saying judges were being appointed on a tribal basis, that there was tribal prejudice in appointment to the judiciary. So he was locked up then, and Rajat Nyogi, the editor, was also locked up. So I issued a statement of protest, you see, and it was circulated. People thought had really gone too far. Makerere people said, this is going to be historic. But In fact, at first it worked out very well, because although the news and the radio that night was discussing a part of this imprisonment and my letter of protest, in general, it seemed things were not too bad. But then I got an invitation to go to Parliament from him, to go to Parliament on a particular day, at a particular time, meaning not to sit in parliamentary seat, but to be available in Parliament. And so I knew that was a command performance. If the head of state says you are to be in Parliament by such and such a time, you better be. So I arranged for someone to give my lecture to my class, and then I went to Parliament. Then it turned out he wanted to give a lecture which would include more or less a denunciation of me, an attack on me. That's the only time where he started reciting other things I had said before, because on one occasion I had said, in Uganda, people, when they see a number of soldiers coming down the road, ordinary citizens shake in their boots because they don't know what treatment they would be given by these soldiers. And at that time, I'd just come back from Ghana, and said there's a major contrast at that time to the soldiers in Ghana, you see, where if they walk around the street and there are citizens there, they're just soldiers. Nobody is terrified. They might be humiliated by them.
Well, have African attitudes to government property changed since independence? Let me tell you a story. Rumor has it that not long after Ghana's independence, one conscientious auditor discovered irregularities. He went to report to his superior officer. There was evidence of gross misappropriation of government resources. The worldly wise superior officer got up, put his arm round the idealistic young auditor and said, "My dear boy, you don't seem to realize that Kwame Nkrumah has killed an elephant. There is more than enough for us all to chop." Nkrumah was, of course, the president of Ghana at that time. The elephant in question was the colonial state lying at his feet. Nkrumah's supporters were saying that there was more than enough for them all to eat. There hasn't been much of a change in African attitudes to government property since those old colonial days.
In my view, Africa's weakness is mainly due to three things: technological underdevelopment, organizational incompetence, and military impotence. It is aggravated by political instability, social corruption, and the whole crisis of moral ambivalence arising out of the bubbling of the cultural melting pot. Implicit in concepts like Pax Britannica was the assumption that Western powers have special privileges for being armed to the teeth, while at the same time proceeding to disarm the natives. It was readily assumed that Western powers were civilized enough to initiate world wars, but Africans had to be stopped from waging tribal conflicts.
Profesa Mazrui ambaye ni mzaliwa wa Mombasa, Februari mwaka 1933, anatoka katika ukoo wa Mazrui waliokuwa watawala wa enzi ya sultan. Alianza kufanya kazi ya ukarani wa benki, lakini akajitoa kwa kujitafutia ufadhili wa masomo, fursa ambayo ilimpeleka katika chuo kikuu cha Manchester nchini Uingereza na kupata shahada yake ya kwanza mnamo mwaka 1960. Kadhalika, Profesa Mazrui alisomea katika chuo kikuu cha Columbia nchini Marekani na akapata shahada ya uzamifu kutoka chuo kikuu cha Oxford mnamo mwaka 1966. Mazrui alijiunga na chuo kikuu cha Makerere nchini Uganda akiwa mhadhiri wa kitengo cha sayansi ya siasa hadi mwaka 1973 alipofurushwa na Idi Amin na kutafuta ukimbizi wa kisiasa nchini Marekani baada ya kunyimwa fursa ya kurudi humu nchini na utawala wa Rais Mzee Jomo Kenyatta. Profesa Mazrui, ambaye mbali na kuoa wake wawili Marekani na Nigeria na kuishi Marekani kwa miaka mingi, lakini hakusahau mila na asili yake, Kiswahili, na akiweza kukizungumza kwa ufasaha mkubwa.
Nitasema kwa Kiswahili cha Kimvita, na wale ambao hawakijui uzuri mtanisamehe.
Kuhusu uhusiano wake na msomi Mkenya mwenzake Profesa Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Profesa Mazrui alikuwa na haya ya kusema.
Na ukitaka hakika hakuna watu wengi ambao wasoma lugha ya Kikuyu hapa Marekani. Ngugi akaniandikia akasema, waambie library yenu watuletee subscription, tuwaletee gazeti lenu. Mimi nikamwandikia nikamwambia, sikiza, mimi subscription yangu mwenyewe binafsi hii, lakini hapa library kwetu hakuna mtu atakayesoma lugha ya Kikuyu, na katika Marekani naona labda ufanye gazeti ni la lugha mbili, uwe la Kikuyu na la Kiswahili.
Profesa Mazrui, ambaye ni mmoja wa wasomi 100 watajika wanaotambulika kote duniani, akiwa Mkenya wa pekee kufika ngazi hiyo, hakuwa na ukuruba na wenyeji wa Mombasa na Kenya nzima kwa jumla. Hata hivyo, alikuwa mtetezi mkubwa wa lugha na utamaduni wa Kiswahili.
Katika Marekani naona labda ufanye gazeti ni la lugha mbili, uwe la Kikuyu na la Kiswahili. Ukifanya ni la lugha mbili, pengine idadi ya wale watu wanaosoma jarida lako litaongezeka mara 4 au mara 5. Na mimi ilinipitikia kama kwamba, wajua, mara nyingine watu husema Kiswahili kinaua lugha nyingine za ndogo ndogo za Kiafrika. Kwa kuwa kila Kiswahili kikienda juu, lugha nyingine karibuni pale huwazenda chini.
Profesa Mazrui ameandika zaidi ya vitabu 30 na kutoa mihadhara katika vyuo vikuu kote duniani. Ni mtu wa pekee ambaye amewahi kukutana na viongozi wengi mashuhuri katika maisha yake. Marehemu ameacha wajane 2 na watoto 5 na wajukuu kadhaa. Nikiripotia Citizen Nipashe, mie ni Swaleh Mdoe.
Mama Ararira. This is Democracy Now! And of course that flight that went down was last Thursday night, that crashed just outside of Buffalo, New York. As we turn now to our next guest, an intellectual giant in African studies for the past 4 decades. In 2005, Foreign Policy and Prospect magazines named him among the top 100 public intellectuals in the world, written over 30 enormously influential books, including Towards a Pax Africana, The African Condition, Black Reparations in the Era of Globalization, The Power of Babel, Language and Governance in the African Experience, Islam Between Globalization and Counterterrorism, as well as the book The African Predicament and the American Experience, A Tale of Two Edens. He's written and narrated a much-discussed 1986 TV series on BBC and PBS called The Africans, A Triple Heritage. I'm talking about the Kenyan-born Pan-Africanist thinker Ali Mazrui. He is Albert Schweitzer Professor in Humanities and Director of the Institute for Global Cultural Studies at State University of New York, Binghamton. Born in Mombasa in Kenya in 1933, Dr. Mazrui studied in Manchester, New York, and Oxford, then became a professor in Uganda. In 1973, forced into exile by the Ugandan dictator Idi Amin, and has taught in the United States as well as at institutions around the world. In addition to his appointments at Binghamton, Professor Mazrui is also Albert Luthuli Professor at Large at University of Jos in Nigeria, the Andrew D. White Professor at Large Emeritus and Senior Scholar in Africana Studies at Cornell University, and he is Chancellor of Jomo Kenyatta University of Agriculture and Technology in Kenya. Professor Ali Mazrui joins us now in our Firehouse studio. Welcome to Democracy Now!
Delighted to be here, Amy, and congratulations on your very successful program.
It is great to have you with us. You have had many experiences in your life that really go to the connection between the United States and Africa. You met with the founding president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, in New York, as well as other places. You were driven out of Uganda by Idi Amin, though met with him many times. You met with Jomo Kenyatta. You're the chancellor of a university by that name in Kenya. You met with the Queen of England and sat in a tent with Muammar Gaddafi and discussed world affairs. You just had tea with the Indian Prime Minister in November. This is the 100th anniversary of the birth of Kwame Nkrumah, the founding president of Ghana. It's also the time of the election of the first black president of the United States, his father from Kenya, Barack Obama. I heard you speak yesterday at the International Studies Association in New York, and you said it's bigger than that for Barack Obama.
Yes, indeed. Barack Obama is setting a precedent not just for the United States, but for the entire Western world. In none of the countries in the Western world with a wide majority population has there been an election to install a head of state or a head of government who was black.
So you're saying he's the first black president of the Western Hemisphere?
And of the Western world. That is including Europe, not just the Western Hemisphere, but the Western world as a whole. Because we keep on wondering when we'll have a black president of France, for example, although there's been progress in appointing ministers who are from Africa or from the world of color. And then a black prime minister of Great Britain would be very nice, and I'm sure it will happen, not necessarily in my lifetime, but probably in yours or in the lifetime of my children. And then, even more surprising, but historically, but perfectly understandable in modern terms, a black chancellor of Germany. And that will take a while. But I'm sure because of Barack Obama and breaking that original taboo in the Western world about appointing as heads of state people who are not of European extraction, it opens other doors around the Western world as well as the Western Hemisphere. And then Barack Obama himself becomes the most powerful single black individual in the history of civilization. You know, there's never been a person in control of the resources which the United States has, of the creative and destructive powers that the United States has. We've had great individuals in African history, like Menelik II of Ethiopia, or Ramses II of Egypt, or even more recent one like Kwame Nkrumah. Those were powerful within their countries or their regions. They were not globally powerful in the sense in which a president of the United States is. So he's easily the most powerful single black individual that's ever walked planet Earth. And that's a major breakthrough in race relations.
His father also is Kenyan, as you are.
Yes, indeed.
The significance of Barack Obama's links, his relations to Kenya.
Yes, well, although I didn't know the older Barack Obama personally, we share friends. They're friends even now. I talk to for information about the older Obama, and we are waiting for the first book about the older Obama, the father, which will be published in Nairobi.
Really?
Yes.
He was a student at University of Hawaii.
Yes.
And also at Harvard?
Yes, he did go to Harvard as well, yes. And then he went back home and he had ups and downs with the authorities. Unfortunately, the way I have had ups and downs with the authorities.
What do you mean ups and downs with the authorities?
Well, he, unlike me, he actually was a part of the government because he was appointed into the civil service. And then now and again he took positions which put him into a bad light with the authorities, including his very strong position upon the assassination of Tom Mboya, who was a fellow Luo, but much more important, he was a potential next president after Kenyatta, and was probably eliminated because of those credentials, presidential credentials for Kenya. And the older Obama was trying to get the government to be much more serious about investigating and not to engage in cover-up, because the chances were that people in government knew about the plot to kill Mboya and were hiding. So he was a fairly brave man, and he was sacked out of the civil service on one occasion and then readmitted later on. He had ups and downs, but he didn't realize he had produced a son who would change the history of race relations in the world.
How do you respond to someone like critics like Glenn Ford? He writes for the Black Agenda Report, who says Obama will provide U.S. empire with a black face, and that could be very destructive.
It is a risk, really, because sometimes people are swallowed up by the position they occupy. I would hope he would help reshape the position he occupies, the presidency of the United States. And I've spoken, including in India, the one thing I hope he will avoid is initiate another military conflict for the United States, because since the 1930s, every single American president has initiated a conflict, either a large-scale war or some kind of confrontation with another country involving weapons. Everybody since Franklin D. Roosevelt. So my hope is he will break that tendency for the American president to feel the way to be really presidential and commander-in-chief is to be ordering an army into action on another society.
And what sense do you have that he will go that way? I mean, since he has come into office, we see one after another of these unmanned drone attacks in Pakistan. Of course, while he says he's going to draw down in Iraq, he's talking about a surge that'll double the force in Afghanistan.
Absolutely. So at the moment, I'm not optimistic that he'll necessarily be just a peacemaking president with the conflicts that are on. So my dream was he will be the first president not to start a conflict, not that he would be the first president
not to preside over a war because he's inheriting two wars anyhow. And then with one of them, the Afghanistan, he's not planning to end it, really. He's planning to escalate it for a while. So that is disappointing.
Mazrui is a library that came and went, but his ideas are going to survive. Yes. It's very interesting that Peter used an analogy with Paul. Most scholars of religion see Christianity as Pauline Christianity, because Paul was not a disciple, but he had greater influence, except for Peter, than all the rest. You see, so Mazrui is going to be remembered by many of the Africans of the younger generation. The intellectuals will see him coming.
And Peter may in fact have a point, because I have read variously that Mazrui in Africa, when he was still at Makerere, was frankly, at least according to them, regarded as, very conservative intellectually. But when he came to the United States, he seems to have been liberated and suddenly become like a liberal.
Now, you see, now it's very interesting. No, I'm very happy that you say this, and Bernadette is a witness. And all the people who are listening to you today are all witnesses. When I wrote about Ali myself, 34 years ago, I didn't know him. But the conservative side of Ali you described was there in Ali. Ali Mazrui, together with some other intellectuals I have written about, people like Sayyid Hussein Nasr, who is an Iranian, both of them were conservative at the home front. America's racism, America's attitude towards non-whites, third world people, had a lot of things to do with Ali Mazrui and with people like Sayyid Hussein Nasr and some of the other people like Ismail Farouki and others who are in the Islamic narrative. Some of us have investigated. You are quite correct. Ali was conservative. He was very cautious in terms of how he negotiated, but he was committed to the conservative liberalism from where he came from, Oxford, Cambridge, or London.
Oxford D. Field.
I knew Nyerere much better than I knew Nkrumah, although I met both. I've lived long enough to, to have known both. Yeah. So Nyerere I knew very well. Yeah. So we had many times conversation. But Nkrumah, I studied him. Nkrumah, I studied his ideas, his works, and his presence dominated my PhD thesis. Although I was doing my PhD thesis for a British university, much of what I was bringing in were ideas propagated by Kwame Nkrumah. Africa is the whole continent and not just a racial divide between Arabs and black Africans. I was hoping we would build Pan-Africanism on the basis of the continent and not just on the basis of race. The pain of slavery had not just a negative side, although that's terrible, but a positive side, because it distributed the African people worldwide, so there's an African presence in many continents and many countries. And some of that began as exporting Africans by force, but then gradually Africans fought for their freedom in those countries and finally are making progress. We are at a disadvantage. So at that time, it feeds into the racism of despising us. Whereas if we get together and cultivate greater strength in dealing with other societies, far from being racist, it improves relations between races and makes it easier for Africans to be treated as equals. Well, Africans also learned how to sing, including political singers, for a long time, yeah. So now we're making some effort to sort out our countries and reduce the tendency towards conflict and also to promote creativity in African situations. I don't think we've done well enough with regard to children. Yeah, although children are coming there to see for Jesus, that's good. But the quality of education could be better if we invested more in our schools. One always does feel I should have done this instead of that. Always areas where you wondered, whether I should have done this. But most of the things worked out in the end. The big regrets were much earlier in my life, when I wasn't doing very well and wasn't getting good grades. So, but once I took off, then Alhamdulillah, from then on, all was well. I'm 8 years old, so I'm not as good as I was when I was playing soccer up there. So, but not in writing. I'm still writing. We deliberately aimed for my 80th year to have at least 3 books of mine published, which we have done. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
My colleague Paul Cisco has more on the story.
My name is Ali Mazrui, and I was born in Mombasa, Kenya, grew up there, and then had my higher education in Great Britain and the United States. In fact, one of the benefits of the colonial experience is to awaken us to a shared identity across the continent.
A frequent guest on Straight Talk Africa, the late Professor Mazrui defined an intellectual as a person who has the capacity to be fascinated by ideas and has acquired the skills to handle some of those ideas effectively. By his definition and ours, Ali Mazrui was one of Africa's greatest intellectuals.
Not the fact that he wrote 30 books and over 800 articles and has all the bona fides of a world-class intellectual, It's the fact that he really made the continent of Africa look at itself in a new way.
His was a lifetime of asking and raising issues and ideas that fascinate, inform, and provoke.
Would Africa have been different without colonization? Yes. Africans have to find out themselves by studying themselves what would work best to produce accountable governments. And then if you ask, are African people free? That's a harder question than whether African states are free, because African people sometimes suffer a lack of freedom as a result of their own governments rather than as a result of the global state of affairs.
After the death of the Kenyan-born African scholar, October 12, 2014, Kenya's President Kenyatta said he was a towering academic whose intellectual contributions played a major role in shaping African scholarship. In the early 1970s, he was invited by Ugandan dictator Idi Amin to be his chief international affairs advisor. He refused the invitation and, critical of the powerful Amin, fled the country, often controversial. In the 1980s, he said, "I want Africa to have the bomb, to frighten the system as a whole," a reference to the U.S. and USSR's nuclear domination. His television series, The Africans, A Triple Heritage, praised Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi for inspiring Africans to take their place on the world stage, one denied by the colonial powers. He wrote of the American arrogance of power in world politics and of how a terrorist philosophy had ensnarled Islam. Mazrui stood for the importance of critical thinking and free speech. He suggested a Pan-African Security Council, patterned after the United Nations Security Council, to respond to the continent's failed states and coups. Why, he asked, do post-colonial constitutions omit provisions for an impeachment process, writing, "We might have to wait till the second half-century of the post-colonial era before impeachment replaces the coup as a method of African regime change." Again, Bernadette Paulo.
That despite all the controversy surrounding Ali Mazrui, that he was such a gentle spirit in that he used his life to do good. And I read a eulogy that said that he divided us. He really didn't divide us. He provoked us. He made us think. He stirred us up. And in doing so, he effectuated change in the way we look at things.
Making it a better world.
Making it a better world.
And longtime friend and colleague, Professor Suleiman Yang. Your last words?
He came, he performed, and he departed without being forgotten for his words.
Always provocative, the thoughtful Ali Mazrui was a preeminent scholar and teacher whose lessons for a troubled world and continent endure. Paul Sisko, VOA News.
The final phase of a checkered journey through life for the towering academic giant Professor Ali Alamein Mazrui in the country kicked off after the Turkish Airlines plane carrying his body landed at the Moi International Airport in Mombasa at 3 a.m. in the morning from the United States, where he lived and worked as a professor of political science, African studies, philosophy, interpretation and culture at the State University of New York at Binghamton in the U.S. As the African coastal traditions as well as his Muslim heritage, which form part of his triple heritage that Professor Mazrui has been a stickler for, took center stage, his body was ferried to the Mazrui's home in Diaku area of Old Town Mombasa and later to the 900-year-old Mazrui's family cemetery that sits a few meters from the iconic Fort Jesus, which the Mazrui's family, who are the Sultans of Mombasa, assisted in conquering from the Portuguese in the 17th century. And exactly at 11:30 hours, his remains were lowered into the grave, effectively fulfilling his will of joining his ancestors here in Old Town Mombasa, a decision that, according to a family member, Professor Alamein Mazrui, who stayed with him till his last gasps, confided took the late professor 10 years to make, given his numerous interactions with the world.
The minister would like to just...
Moments later, Chief Justice Dr. Willy Mutunga, who co-authored the late professor's biography, had a stinging attack on the regime in which Professor Mazrui lived under.
His exile represents our discomfort with excellence at home, a pageant for reward, to reward the most undeserving and to punish the most meriting. A strange habit of making competence a burden in this country.
The others present in attendance here at the Aga Khan Academy in Mombasa, where the speeches were made, paid tribute to the fallen academic giant, among them the leader of majority for the National Assembly, Aden Duale, who relayed President Uhuru Kenyatta's message to the family of the late professor.
Professor Mazrui is a household name, not only in Kenya, but in the entire world. He is one of the Kenya's most accomplished scholars and clearly the pride of Mombasa and the coastal region in general.
Is the fact that he was a true Mombasan, born, bred, and now laid to rest in our beloved island. Throughout his life, Professor Mazrui represented what was best that Mombasa and Swahili culture defines its environs.
He is a man we will all remember. He was a great inspiration to all of us.
Pauline Uti Mazrui, who is one of the late Mazrui's widows, giving a compelling insight of how generous the professor was.
Of Ali's nature, he believed in humbleness. Ali will get his salary. By the end of the month, it's gone. He will say, Alhamdulillah, Inshallah, the Lord will provide. He will make sure people who don't have will have. He will distribute his salary.
The late Professor Ali Mazrui is survived by two widows, Molly Vickman, a Briton, who has 3 children, and Pauline Uti Mazrui, who has 2 sons. Professor Ali Mazrui was indeed a shuja in the academic, political and even religious circles, and as Kenyans prepare to mark the Mashujaa tomorrow, it is evident that his discourse will be the subject of discussion in this and very many generations to come. Alex Kubasu, Sunday Live in Old Town, Mombasa County.
Kenya inaomboleza kifo cha msomi wake mtajika aliyesifika ulimwenguni kote, Profesa Ali Mazrui. Msomi huyu ambaye miaka michache iliyopita amekuwa chancellor wa chuo kikuu cha Jomo Kenyatta hapa nchini ameaga dunia nchini Marekani alfajiri ya leo. Mwili wa marehemu utasafirishwa hadi hapa nchini Kenya ili kuzikwa kisiwani Mombasa kama alivyohusia alipokuwa hai. John Juma sasa ametuletea taarifa hiyo, na ambapo aliweza kukutana na jamaa za hayati mjini Mombasa.
Jibu wanaofahamu historia, kumbukumbu na wasifu wa marehemu Profesa Ali Mazrui ni kwamba huku ndiko kitovu chake kilizikwa, nyumba iliyoko nyuma yangu ikiwa ndio alizaliwa, akikulia huku akienda shuleni Sereni na Hamis katika shule ya upili, na kuwa mtu sifika na tajika katika uso wa Mombasa, Kenya, Afrika na ulimwengu kwa jumla.
Ali Mazrui amekuwa ni nyota ya kung'ara dunia nzima katika miaka hayo yote ambayo
ni pigo kubwa sana kwa sisi tu kwetu hapa Kenya, bali kwa ulimwengu mzima, kwa sababu alikuwa mara nyingi anatakikana mahali tofauti tofauti katika ulimwengu kutoa maoni na vile vile kwenda kuhutubia watu katika masuala mbalimbali yanayohusiana na elimu aliyokuwa nayo.
Profesa Ali Mazrui mwenye umri wa miaka 81 aliaga dunia alfajiri ya leo katika hospitali moja nchini Marekani baada ya kuugua kwa muda mrefu.
Kwa muda mrefu amekuwa mgonjwa na alikuwa hospitali na baadaye akarudishwa nyumbani, lakini hali yake bado iliendelea kudhoofika, na jana siku ya Jumapili usiku ndio aliaga.
Hadi kifo chake, Mazrui alikuwa profesa katika chuo kikuu cha Binghamton, New York, miongoni tu mwa vyuo kadhaa katika mabara matano alikofundisha ulimwenguni. Alichapisha zaidi ya vitabu 30 na kuandika zaidi ya tasnifu 100. Alikuwa mfahamu wa kina wa nyendo za jamii, huku akitoa hotuba mbele ya vikao vya kuheshimika kote ulimwenguni kuhusu elimu, dini, tamaduni, siasa na utawala.
Ana utamu wa lugha tangu utotoni.
Profesa Muhammad Haida ambaye ni rafiki wa marehemu waliosoma pamoja katika darasa na shule ya Serani hadi kumaliza, anasema marehemu Ali tangu utotoni alikuwa mlumbi shupavu kimaneno, hasa katika mijadala, na ndoto yake kutaka kuwa mwandishi vitabu ilianzia utotoni.
Siku moja tunketi katika klasi zetu zile za Makuti, saa 10 skuli ishafungwa nini, lakini tumeketi tuzungumza tu. Sasa mzungumza namuuliza, wewe wataka ukitoka hapo ufanye nini yake katika maisha? Ile jawabu yake sijaisahau mpaka leo. Maana siku zile wanake tukufundishwa kwamba nataka kuwa daktari, nataka kuwa mwalimu, nataka kuwa wakili, lakini yake nataka kuwa mwandishi.
Mazrui amekuwa chancellor wa chuo kikuu cha Jomo Kenyatta University of Science and Technology na pia muasisi wa Technical University of Mombasa, chuo ambacho kikianza kiliitwa Mombasa Institute of Muslim Education.
Kwa upande wa elimu alikuwa ni mfano mzuri, kwa sababu leo nafikiri watu wote wa mji huu wa Mombasa na hasa wa Kibokoni hapa wanajivunia mtu kama yeye ambaye amefika ngazi zote hizo.
Kutokana na weledi wake kwenye midahalo, Mazrui alijiondoa nchini Uganda akiwa profesa chuoni Makerere siku za utawala wa Idi.
Kuna viongozi pengine ambao walikuwa hawapendezwi na mambo kama hayo. Hata mara nyingine alipokuwa akija hapa akitaka kutoa lecture alikuwa akipata vikwazo vingi sana.
Kwenye ulingo wa elimu na masomo alitajwa kuwa mmoja wa wale weledi 100 ulimwenguni.
Mfano wake kuweza kuwahimiza watoto wetu ili na wao wafanye shajaa, na wao watumie elimu na wafanye bidii ili kufika kiwango kile.
Mazrui ameacha mjane na watoto 6 ambao ni raia wa Marekani. Familia yake imesema mwili wake utaletwa kwa ndege hadi Mombasa kuzikwa katika makaburi ya familia katika eneo la Fort Jesus kulingana na wosia alioacha.
Mwenyewe alihusia ataka kuzikwa hapa Kenya, Mombasa, na hivi sasa mawasiliano yanaendelea ili kuhakikisha ya kuwa analetwa katika wakati wa karibu unawezekana. Lakini kama mnavyojua Amerika ni mbali, na kesho tunasikia itakuwa kule ni public holiday, Kwa hivyo pengine mipango itaanza Jumatano kutengezwa ili aweze kufika hapa kwa wakati wa karibu inavyowezekana, lakini tutatangaza baadaye lini yatakuwa mazishi yake.
Miongoni mwa maeneo ambayo ameacha alama katika uso wa dunia ni chuo cha Technical University of Mombasa, ambapo pia majengo ya madarasa yameitwa jina lake kama kumbukumbu na heshima kwake, na ni tarajio kwamba wanafunzi na hata wasomi wataendeleza kufanikisha azma aliyokuwa nayo. John Juma, KTN, katika chuo cha TUM mjini Mombasa.
Mombasa, where we will now get an update on what exactly is happening in Mombasa after we received the news earlier during the week that Professor Ali Mazrui had died in the United States at the age of 81.
Body ishaondoka is New York na now it is in Istanbul. Na itafika hapa, itaondoka Istanbul to Mombasa na itafika around 3:10 saa 9 na dakika 10 na alfajiri Jumapili, kisha italetwa hapa nyumbani mpaka saa 3:30 tutaichukua hapa kupeleka msikitini, na kutoka pale msikitini tutarejea, tutakaa about 1 hour or so, kisha itakuja kwa miguu mpaka hapa ili kuzikwa.
Kiislamu it is encouraged kuzika as soon as possible, but it is not forbidden. Kitokea situation kama hizi ambazo number one, ye profesa mwenyewe alihusia, whenever he visited Mombasa anapita pale cemetery ambapo mababu zake na mababu zake walizikwa, na akisema very clearly kwa yeye mwenyewe anataka kuzikwa hapo.
A celebration of his contribution to the United Nations, a place where he often shared his ideas, including as editor of UNESCO's General History of Africa.
Soft-spoken, sharp thinker and bel esprit intellectual, it is no wonder that Professor Mazrui was a sought-after speaker within the UN system and academia.
Kenya's ambassador praised Mazrui for constructing new ideas about the continent in the face of resistance and conservatism.
My hope and prayer is that in turning these books that Mazrui has left for us into materials of pedagogy for our children, we'll be able to reclaim our history. We'll be able to reclaim our culture, our literature, our poetry.
His wife of 23 years shared how her late husband almost followed a different path.
As a student in Oxford, during his undergraduate, he wanted to be a lawyer. And his advisor said, every lawyer is a politician and every politician is a lawyer. He said, you read history. He said, but I wanted to do law so that I can travel, work with the UN. Then his professor said, voila, that's why you should be a teacher, do history. That will expose you. And Africa was just getting his independence. So you will be the pioneers who will lead the continent. And lo and behold, that's what happened.
Speakers praised Mazrui for his penchant for change, as those gathered chanted his name in tribute.
Mzee Ali!
Shervin Briceby's SABC News, New York.
Tell me, what does it look like in heaven? Is it peaceful? Is it free like they say? Does the sun shine bright forever? Have your fears Is it peaceful? Is it free like they say? Does the sun shine bright forever? Have your fears and your pain gone away? 'Cause here on earth it feels like everything good is missing since you left. And here on earth everything's different. There's an emptiness. Oh, I hope you're dancing in the sky.
The biggest gift you can give your loved one who has already passed on is just to say, "Oh Allah, have mercy on him. Forgive him and grant him paradise." Or, "Have mercy on her. Forgive her and grant her paradise." Allahumma ghfir lahu warhamhu wasakkinhu fil jannah. If there are more, you can say, "Allahumma ghfir lahum warhamhum wasakkinhum fil jannah." Oh Allah, forgive them, have mercy on them and grant them Jannah.